You know, sitting in a hot tub is usually the last place you'd want someone to talk about an ongoing war, but I think it's emblematic of the fact that my experience as an American right now is vastly different from that of the average Ukrainian. However, it hasn't stopped me from endlessly mulling over the war as it happens in real time, and since the developing stalemate, I've begun to contemplate how the situation unfolded the way it has. Virtually no one predicted that Russia would actually go through with its invasion, but those same people then claimed Kiev would fall within days of the war starting. Even as Ukraine fought back, most surprising of all was the utter operational failure of Russia's army from the get-go. So, why did everyone get this conflict unbelievably wrong? It's complicated. Trust me. But any singular answer must trace back to the rationale of the Kremlin, the party that started this whole conflict. In order to understand the choices and missteps of Vladimir Putin, we have to consider his perspective and motives. And that's why we're here. I will attempt to present a narrative of Putin's relationship with Ukraine and how recent events may have shaped his foreign policy throughout the years. Contrary to assumptions often made in the West, the issue of Russian influence over Ukraine has been historically divisive for the country. While Ukrainian nationalism will find strong support in the Northwest, residents of the Southeast historically identify more with Russia. This is helped by the East having a larger Russian population and more Russian speakers. Since independence, this ethnic rift has dominated Ukraine's political system, but recent decades have called into question the integrity of the Eastern faction. In 2004, the pro-Russian candidate attempted to claim power via electoral fraud, but nationwide protests forced him to concede defeat. He was later elected legitimately in 2010 and promised that he would support Ukraine's integration with the EU. However, when the time came, he axed those plans in favor of an agreement involving Russia. Many suspected that this was done at the behest of the Kremlin, and protests erupted across western Ukraine. Yanukovych would send police to forcefully disperse the crowds, but this only escalated violence until the threat of armed insurrection forced him to flee for Russia. As the Northwest celebrated, the nation's Southeast met the news with consternation, and no one was more distraught than Putin himself. His best hope of absorbing Kiev into Russia's sphere had vanished, and Moscow now needed to rapidly mitigate their westward jolt. Just 5 days after Yanukovych fled, the Kremlin invaded Crimea, a largely pro-Russian peninsula off southern Ukraine. Residents celebrated the occupiers as major Ukrainian officials seized the opportunity to defect. Russia later annexed Crimea in a major blow to Ukraine, which was already facing droves of pro-Yanukovych protests in its east. The ensuing months saw many of these metamorphose into secessionist movements. It wouldn't have been a fault to assume that Ukraine was teetering on the brink of collapse, but the situation has to be understood from the perspective of Moscow. After Yanukovych's ouster, the Kremlin deployed over 40,000 soldiers to the Ukrainian border, but never intended to go through with a full invasion. Previous conflicts like the Russo-Georgian War had revealed critical flaws in the Russian army, which still needed to be fixed. For Putin, invading Crimea was a path of least resistance, risking fewer casualties while barring Kiev from fully moving westward. This restraint would continue through the separatist movements springing up across the southeast, which Russia would aggravate without directly committing forces. In Kharkiv, individuals widely believed to be Russian nationals stormed government buildings in an attempt to incite an uprising. While this failed over a lack of support, efforts in Ukraine's Far East were more popular and better coordinated. Armed rebels would seize administrative buildings from which they declared people's republics, afterwards fanning out across the cities and countryside to secure their autonomy. Many of these groups just so happened to be led by former agents of Moscow, with their weaponry and training also being provided by the Russian army. Putin had found a way to destabilize Ukraine without attacking the whole country, but the tides of war were turning against the Donbas rebels. So, the Kremlin invaded Ukraine for a second time, but denied doing so after Ukrainian soldiers attacked their convoys. Neither side wanted a full-scale war, but Putin's immediate goals were achieved. Moscow comfortably negotiated for peace while working to subvert any lasting ceasefires. The time between Minsk II and the current invasion saw Putin attempt to re-establish his sway over Ukraine. However, the country's political landscape was changing. Many of the pro-Russian movements outside the Donbass had dissipated, while Ukrainians in the long-term sought an alternative to their ethnically split government. That chance emerged through the profane tirades of one teacher railing against corruption. This man is fictional, but the actor who portrayed him hit a chord with much of Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is a child of the southeast whose native language is Russian, but during Euromaidan, he sided with the protests. His sitcom Servant of the People projected the frustrations many had with the country, and the comedian used this platform to launch a presidential campaign. Many feared that Zelenskyy would be an easy pawn for Moscow, but others saw in him an opportunity to mend ties with the East. The latter idea triumphed as the actor received nearly 3/4 of the popular vote on policies supporting westward integration. The Kremlin no longer had as strong support among Ukrainians, and Western aid to Kiev's military was sapping Putin's options. Events across the world, though, would suggest that these advancements were not as reliable as they seemed. In Afghanistan, departing U.S. forces expected a large and modern Afghan army to hold off the Taliban for at least 6 months. Instead, the country collapsed in days as fleeing soldiers abandoned advanced weaponry and politicians fled Kabul. If Ukrainians acted similarly and the West refused to directly intervene, a full-scale invasion could have worked. The Kremlin thus moved troops to the border for a second time that year. The moment was ripe. For Putin, this seemed like his last good chance at forcing all of Ukraine back into his orbit.